Hello everyone, my name is Jfk Pasupathi. I'm the Associate Dean of the Hofstra University Honors College and also an Associate Professor of English. I'm happy to present a recording of an event that we held on March 3rd of 2021, which featured the author Colin Dickey. Colin Dickey has an MFA in creative writing from the California Institute of the Arts and a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Southern California. He's taught creative writing at National University since 2002 and has written on conspiracy theories and other fringe beliefs for such places as Lapham's Quarterly, The Believer, The New Republic, Gen Magazine, and others. He's the author of 4 books that take up similar topics. Most recently, The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained, and Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places. Ghostland, like earlier books, Cranioclepty, which is a book about grave digging and analyzing the skulls of long-dead geniuses, and the afterlives of the saints, are focused on matters related to mortality, even though, as you can see in Colin's person today, that he doesn't look especially emo or goth. But his works along these lines has made him the perfect director of a museum that used to live near the fetid Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, the Morbid Anatomy Museum. And here I just want to give a quick shout out and an RIP to the Morbid Anatomy Museum, which has a special place in my heart because I once took some honors college students to visit it in 2016, where we watched the silent 1925 version of The Phantom of the Opera with a live DJ, and we got to see an exhibit of the great Victorian taxidermist Walter Potter, who made elaborate scenes like the one you can see down on the right, with some taxidermied kittens getting married. Anyway, even when Colin's work is focused on death, his writing is always a reminder of humanity, heart, and life. He can turn something completely tacky, like that 12-foot skeleton from Home Depot, into a meditation on mourning that both surprises and comforts us with its depth. He can gently explain why we shouldn't romanticize nature. Well before the advent of a popular podcast, he was the one telling us that we were wrong about things. One of those things some people will remember here is a myth put forth by a Walt Disney documentary from the 50s called White Wilderness. Many people probably remember this, though I know the students are too young. In the documentary, it showed us a story about these rodents called lemmings. These little animals it presented as born conformist with the death wish. You can see in the clip on the right-hand side a vision of the small little rodents plunging themselves en masse to their death. It turns out this baffling behavior, it was manufactured by Disney. In the piece up to the right, A View to a Kill, Dickey tells us, in reality, the lemmings were flown to Alberta by the film's producers and herded off the cliff. Now you might think that these falsehoods are a thing of a bygone era of nature documentary filmmaking, but you would be wrong. Dickey shows us that shows like Planet Earth continue to perpetuate facile narratives about animals for lucrative human consumption. And then there's this essay for the New Republic, in which Dickey brings our investment in anthropomorphizing to a halt with an opening line that's hard to forget, but easy to forgive. First, he says, it's important to ruin Finding Nemo for you. For if you wanted to tell the story of a single father helping a young son grow into adulthood after the tragic death of his mother and siblings, clownfish are, without a doubt, the wrong animals to use. Marlin, for one, wouldn't have been Coral's only husband. As the dominant female clownfish of the anemone, she would have had several husbands. She also would have been significantly larger than Marlin or any of her other men, while we're splitting scales. But assuming that all of the other dads were killed along with Coral and the other kids, then Marlin, being the largest remaining male clownfish, would have done what any good father would have done. He would have changed his sex, becoming the dominant female. Clownfish, after all, are protandrous hermaphrodites, starting out male and later becoming female as the need arises. That would leave Nemo, formerly Marlin's son, as the remaining male in the anemone, and once he was finally bound, he'd be ready to assume the role of the new mate, becoming his former dad's new husband. Now, if you love Finding Nemo, or any wholesome family entertainment, this will be a lot to take in. But along with the real talk that Colin brings, there's also a real generosity here. Colin not only understands the dumb things we want to believe, but also why we believe and take comfort in them. In most cases, he brings light and truth, but also a surprising degree of optimism. In both Ghostland and The Unidentified, Dickey offers explanations for fringe beliefs that make perfect sense, never normalizing or apologizing for the inexplicable, but occasionally empathizing and encouraging readers to laugh without disdain. This may not be the case with the subjects he's writing about in his current book, which is slated to come out in 2022, on conspiracy theories surrounding secret societies. This will examine some of the more troubling groups of believers, like QAnon, that are behind violence and the promotion of white supremacy. We've invited him here today to talk more about his current book, both the subjects and the phenomenon it covers, but also what it's like to approach these subjects as a writer and an intellectual too smart and ethical to ever be taken in. How does a person write about people whose lives revolve around elaborate falsehoods while keeping it real? This is a question that I know is of interest to all of our guests today, many of whom are current scholars or future writers, and there's no one who can answer it better than our speaker. Dr. Dickey will begin our conversation today by reading some material that's dear to his heart. So now I'll turn things over to him. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody for spending your afternoon with me. So what I'm going to talk about, so my last book, The Unidentified, started out as a kind of broader survey of various conspiracy theories. There was going to be some stuff on anti-Semitism and Freemasons and other stuff. And it was pretty wide-ranging, and at some point it became sort of untenable, and so I decided to cut it back. And I decided to focus on 4 things that really mattered to me that were going to be the heart of the book, which was lost continents, Atlantis and Lemuria, cryptids, Bigfoot, UFO, or Loch Ness Monster, etc., UFOs and aliens, and then lastly, the flat Earth conspiracy theory. And I wrote a draft of the book, and it sort of kept not coming together, and it took me forever to accept the fact that the flat Earth just didn't fit, and it broke my heart because it was kind of my favorite part of the book, but I had to cut it out because it didn't fit with the rest of the book. It fit in like several axes that mattered, but there were problems, and maybe we could talk about in the Q&A about what didn't work. It will make a little bit more sense after reading. But so I cut out this cool part about I went to Edmonton, Canada to hang out with flat earthers, and I was sad to not have that in the book. So it's now this sort of weird freestanding essay that I'm not entirely sure what to do with. So I'm going to read that, and it should take about 25 minutes, and then we can talk about that, or we can talk about whatever else you guys want to. The only thing, I don't have slides, but I'm going to show you, this is the logo of the United Nations, which some of you have probably seen before. And just because I don't spend too much time talking about it in the piece, I just wanted it as background. This is the prevailing model of how flat earthers argue the world is constructed. And they talk about the fact that the United Nations uses it as logo a lot, like as proof that the UN knows. But as you could see, or hopefully you could see, the North Pole is at the center of this disc, right? And Europe and North America Asia sort of look normal, but then things get sort of increasingly distorted in South America, Australia, and Africa. And the idea is that there's no continent of Antarctica. There is a kind of like a rim of like glaciers that mark the edge of the flat disk. And so that's the kind of just like a sort of visual representation of the kind of flat Earth idea. So I'm going to shut that off again, and I'm just going to So I'm just gonna read this thing for about 25-ish minutes, and hopefully it sounds okay. All right. The skies over Edmonton, Canada are blanketed with a smoke that has turned the sky a dirty mustard yellow. Late summer wildfires are burning across the western half of North America, part of what has become an almost omnipresent feature of the August landscape. Flying up from California, I'd followed the blanket of smoke between me and the earth below, distant as a dream or a myth. Now on the ground, temperatures are hot and everything outside is a haze. But not inside the West Edmonton Mall, the world's largest mall, a playground of simulacra, commerce, and lunacy that is my ultimate destination. In the convention center of the attached Fantasyland Hotel, where you can rent themed rooms that include Polynesian, Roman, or outer space decors, is the 2018 Flat Earth International Conference. The conference is well attended. A large ballroom is filled comfortably with somewhere around 250 attendees. The stage is professional, the speakers are mic'd and flanked by large monitors. And the first speaker, as close as the Flat Earth community has to a rock star, is a man named Mark Sargent. Sargent is the creator of the popular YouTube video Under the Dome, which has logged over 3.7 million hits and which argues that belief in a spherical Earth is in fact a recent delusion. As he narrates in the video, for the first 4,000 years of our civilization, we believed that the Earth was a flattish disk surrounded by a solid dome barrier called the firmament. All of the 5 major religions had their own version of this, and the churches enforced the belief. Then around 1514, a man named Copernicus created a new model of the world. The new worldview was promoted and took hold. The religions adapted to handle the new reality, and life moved on. More importantly, the globe model was quickly introduced into education systems. Over the next 500 years, the challenges to this model faded to the point where the globe was accepted as universally as physical laws such as gravity. None of this is true. Sorry. Humans have always understood that the planet they lived on was spherical, always. The idea that we once believed that the world was flat until Columbus decided to prove everyone wrong is a 19th century fiction, one that was promoted, ironically, by scientists. The prime examples of flat Earth belief were 2 early writers, Lactantius and Cosmas Indicopleustes. Sorry if I'm butchering that, any Latinists out there. Lactantius was a 3rd century pagan convert to Christianity who was eventually deemed heretical after his death. Cosmos was a 6th century mariner and topographer, best known for his atlas Christian Topography. But to say best known is a bit of a stretch, since only 3 manuscripts of his work survived past his death, and the first translation from Greek into Latin wasn't until 1706, hardly indicative of a landmark work being widely read and disseminated throughout the Christian world. You can be forgiven if you've never heard of Lactantius or Cosmas, even though you probably have heard of Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Euclid, as well as St. Ambrose, the Venerable Bede, and Thomas Aquinas. All of these more well-known figures and many more knew the earth to be round. The main question for much of the Greek and medieval periods in Europe was not the shape of the earth, but its diameter, and whether or not anyone lived on the other side of the globe. Washington Irving's 1828 book, History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, contains an entirely invented scene in which Columbus faces off against priests, quoting Lactantius, who they call a redoubted champion of the faith. Irving claims to his simplest proposition, the spherical form of the earth, were opposed figurative texts of scriptures. The story is itself a total fiction, but it gradually became gospel among pro-science zealots eager to reveal the ignorance of believers. William Wilwell, a trained theologian and priest who was nonetheless fascinated by experimental science, singled out the culprits of Lactantius and Cosmos in his 1837 book, History of Inductive Sciences, in a passage entitled Neglect of Physical Reasoning in Christendom. In 1897, Andrew Dixon White, founder and first president of Cornell University, published his book, History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, a polemic in which White attacked religious fundamentalists for their disbelief in science. Among the many examples he cited was how Christian theologians rejected the Greek view of a spherical earth in favor of a flat disk. The idea that humans believed for thousands of years that the earth was flat was, in other words, a modern invention promoted by scientists to prove how far we had come from an age of superstition and ignorance. And here in the Fantasyland Hotel Convention Center, that false narrative was being promoted to attack scientists as though we had come full circle. Months before the convention, I'd spent over an hour talking to Sargent about his beliefs and the flat earth movement. Sargent, whatever else one may say about him, is unfailingly pleasant, with an unflappable yet gentle demeanor. He is extremely giving of his time, always willing to talk to anyone, skeptic or believer. He is the best possible public face a fringe movement could want, articulate even in his incoherence, and polite even at his most pugnacious. If so many people at this conference seem eager to shake his hand, it's no doubt because he's made the movement welcoming and he's helped these people to feel seen. Sargent told me his interest stemmed from Admiral Robert Byrd's exploration work in Antarctica. After Byrd hinted that there was a gold mine of natural resources waiting to be plundered in Antarctica, he returned to command the US Navy expedition Operation Deep Freeze in 1955. As Sargent told me, he goes down there in 55 and 56, and everything changed after that. The world literally changed. Every move that the governments made at the highest echelons of power were deliberate, they were strange, and they were very calculated. For Sargent, the idea of an international cooperative to set aside resource-rich Antarctica as a scientific preserve belied all common sense and understanding of how governments and corporations work. He argues that the fact that no government or energy company has ever seriously challenged the Antarctic treaty system suggests that these governments and corporations bound up in them all know something the rest of us don't. That knowledge is not only that the Earth is flat, but also, as he explains in his 2-hour video, that the government is hiding the existence of God. If the firmament was indeed discovered in 1956, he says, and it was deliberately hidden, then the ruling authority not only hid the structure, but evidence of the builders, and by builders I mean creators, and by that I mean what people define as God. Repeatedly singling out NASA as being behind a massive cover-up, Sargent's understanding of the flat Earth appears to be primarily based on a distrust of government. In our conversation, he referenced Enron's collapse, JFK's assassination, and other threads that pointed to government corruption and conspiracy. As he told me at one point, when you get to a certain level of power, you tend to bend the rules in your favor because it benefits you and because you can get away with it. This, it seems, is for Sargent a more ironclad rule of the laws of physics and history than any purported evidence for a spherical planet. Sargent is here today to build a community, affirming that the people gathered here are a select coterie of enlightened elites. Flat earthers certainly see themselves as a cut above. The mantra of the modern flat earth movement is, do your own research. It's repeated by numerous speakers, affirmed to me by several attendees, and you can buy a mug with the phrase. Doing your own research means not accepting scientific status quo, not accepting whatever your teacher told you in school, not accepting something just because everybody else believes it. It's a seductive slogan since it's self-selecting. These are the elite who've refused to be suckers, who've struck out on their own. It turns out, though, doing your own research doesn't mean having all the answers. A couple of times, Mark Sargent is pressed on various aspects of his theories, as often from believers who are hoping to bolster their own understanding as from skeptics. And there is, frankly, a fair amount he can't explain. When he runs into trouble, he defaults to a series of relatively predictable moves. He will often reply to a difficult question by asserting that science can't answer it either. He will also summarily blame NASA or the American government, which here in Canada plays pretty well. Lastly, if something seems grossly inconsistent, he will suggest that perhaps something is gradually being revealed and that all will become clear once the veil is finally pulled back. At one point, Sargent is asked about the Southern Hemisphere, which, according to his flat Earth map, is considerably larger than the Northern, meaning that the distances between South America and Africa would be vast, too vast to travel by commercial airliner. Sargent demurs and begins talking about how difficult it is to think in 3 dimensions, and that there's no accurate maps of what the flat Earth actually looks like. Each flat Earth proof or illustration is only as good until it's not, and then the goalposts are pushed back further and further until they're past Antarctica. This is a seltzer, by the way, in case anybody thinks it's 3 p.m. I'm drinking. During the first break, I wandered outside for a breath of fresh air and to clear my head, but this was a mistake. The smoke from the forest fires was so dense, there was no fresh air to be had. The sky was a milky orange, and within minutes, my nose and fingertips were tingling slightly due to diminished oxygen. So I retreated back inside to the mall, which stretches on for what seems like forever. Near the hotel is a large lagoon with a pirate ship, and I watched as an opera singer stood on the deck and sang an aria to throngs of apathetic shoppers, her voice bouncing off the glass and concrete. Then I went back into the convention. Sargent is something of an outlier in the flat earth community since he's less overtly religious than many of the speakers. For Matt Long, who follows Sargent, flat earth is about your relationship to God. His talk begins with a long, rambling story of his own conversion, one peppered with a number of light jokes that mostly fall flat. He loses the audience quickly since his tone, temper, and patter are church testimonial. Eventually, he gets to the flat earth, but then moves on just as quickly. He ends his talk by stating, "Light and truth will help you way more than math and science will," a phrase that elicits strong applause and a scattering of amens. One attendee, a man named Chris, tells me he's a practicing doctor who specializes in family medicine. Chris got into flat earth about 3 years ago, he says. His son was diagnosed with autism, which he soon attributed to vaccines. Once an anti-vaxxer, he began to question everything. The first scientific idea he had discarded was evolution, and once he threw out evolution, he was left with the Bible. From there, he soon saw that the Bible was incompatible with a spherical earth. He doesn't go to church, he studies the Bible by himself, and he tells me the spherical earth conspiracy is maintained by 13 powerful families, including the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, who received their directives directly from Satan. Gravity, he maintains, is a lie, and Newton was a Freemason, he says, as though this last revelation ties everything together. When I asked Chris about his medical work, he admits under questioning that he doesn't always, quote, do his own research. When presented with a patient whose symptoms you don't recognize, I ask him, wouldn't you consult the literature and see how other doctors have treated that patient? In the time it takes you to do your own research, you might lose the patient, and you might not have the luxury to do that research. Yes, he admits at last this is true. It's perhaps a minor point, but Chris uses scientific knowledge like anti-vaxxers use herd immunity. They employ it frequently when it suits them and reap all the benefits of it, while still poisoning the well. The do your own research mantra also means there's not a lot of agreement among flat earthers. We're divided on a number of issues, Sargent says at one point. We all agree it's not a globe, but beyond that, we all have our own thing. One speaker actually refers to the flat earth model before correcting himself. We're not saying there is a model, he says, and then trails off. If you ask flat earthers about the moon, for example, competing theories abound. Some people will tell you it's a sphere floating in the sky, revolving just like the sun. For others, though, it's a flat disk. Even among this latter group, there's disagreement as to whether it reflects the sunlight or emits its own. But no one wants to seriously delve into these disagreements because to do so might risk admitting that the whole idea is nonsense, or worse, create factions within an already tiny group. The only thing you have to agree on to be part of this community is right there in the name. The earth is flat. Flat earthers define themselves in opposition to the mainstream. They are against rather than for. And because there is no stable agreed upon doctrine of flat earthers, it is very difficult to debate or debunk any of their ideas. I believe aliens are coming from below, one attendee named Birdie tells me. I think they're demons. Her father, she says, will not tolerate her flat earth obsession, but her mother has agreed to accompany her and seems mostly bemused by the conversations. Family tensions are, after all, common here. People talk about being disowned by their parents, and Matt Long compares telling his family that he believed in a flat earth to coming out of the closet. In the afternoon, the members of a popular YouTube series, Globebusters, take the stage with the goal of actually offering some Flat Earth 101. Their explanations are painfully inadequate. According to mainstream science, they claim the Southern Hemisphere is closer to the sun than the Northern Hemisphere, yet Antarctica isn't necessarily warmer than the Arctic. It makes no sense, Bob Knodel repeatedly says, which, to be fair, is an accurate statement. It makes no sense because no one believes the Southern Hemisphere is closer to the sun than the Northern Hemisphere. Meanwhile, there's no discussion of ocean currents, climate patterns, or any of the other complex systems that determine weather and temperature in different parts of the globe. Their arguments all seem to rest on debunking whatever basic understanding of Earth science one received in grade school. There's a mystifying amount of time devoted to the question of why planes that fly with the Earth's rotation don't reach their destination faster than those that fly against it. Nodal at one point cautions against a smoking gun, preferring instead the idea of, quote, a preponderance of evidence. Arguing the Earth is flat involves heaping a bunch of quibbles, cavils, and caveats, hoping that, taken together, they'll sway the uninitiated. There can be no smoking gun, after all, because, of course, the Earth isn't flat. One thing globebusters all agree on, though, is that no one who has ever been to Antarctica has ever seen 24-hour sun. And here's where the do your own research mantra all begins to fade away. One member, Geron Campanella, says that people have offered to fly him to Antarctica to see for himself the 24-hour sun. But he says that even if he saw it for himself, he wouldn't believe it. He admits he'd assume it was a concocted hoax for his own benefit. Do your own research, it turns out, is just code for believe what you want to believe. On the second day of the conference, the tone seems to change. More and more of the stranger conspiracies come out. There's an argument that Gus Grissom, who died with two others on the launch pad in Apollo 1, was in fact assassinated by the Illuminati, and that his death was a secret blood sacrifice after he threatened to reveal the space program was a hoax. There's a great deal of discussion about the secret magnetic mountain at the North Pole surrounded by a 500-mile wide whirlpool. Hillary Clinton's constant reference during the 2016 election to hitting the glass ceiling is proof, we are told, that she knew about the firmament dome over the flat Earth. And there's news of Donald Trump's creation of a new branch of the military, the Space Force, which someone suggests may mean that the United States government is planning to start a war with God. Additionally, the pleasant demeanor of someone like Mark Sargent has been swapped out for the far more pugnacious Rob Skiba, who consistently berates scientists and those who believe in astronomy and evolution. I'm not going to let people who think that they came from monkeys ridicule me, he bellows at one point. But he also rejects creationists and those he deems insufficiently literalist in their biblical interpretations. The Bible, he argues, is not reconcilable with a spherical understanding of Earth, and any attempts to reconcile Christianity with scientific principles are only attempts to make God into a liar. That's ultimately where all this is going. All the scientific veneer is eventually stripped away, and biblical literalism is all that's left. One attendee states her belief that flat Earth will come to be seen as the test. Do you believe in God or do you believe in man? Even the less religiously motivated among the speakers are predicting, one way or another, an apocalypse. Mark Sargent doesn't come out and say this right away, but eventually he gets to the point. If the Earth is flat, he suggests, then evolution would be revealed to be a sham, and world markets would be upended. The revelation of the flat Earth would itself be out of the book of Revelation, such a stunning and cosmic reversal of everything we know and believe that it would completely bring about the end of the status quo. The flat Earth for Sargent is really about the end of this world and the beginning of a new one. Sometime in the afternoon of the second day, about 2 hours before the end of the conference, the shopping mall's fire alarms start to go off. No one knows what to do. Do we evacuate or is it a false alarm? But no one comes rushing in, waving their arms, telling us to flee. So after a few nervous moments of looking around, the speakers continue. The fire alarms continue for several minutes before we're given the all clear. A few minutes later, they start up again. They will continue on and off for the rest of the conference. What is starting to become clear to me is that the flat Earth phenomenon has nothing to do with the shape of the Earth. It is, Sargent says, the tip of the spear, the secret that's so big that it allows for literally anything else. What has brought these people together is not the shape of the planet, but a belief that there's something big they're not telling us, a giant truth that's hiding just out of view. It's a crowdsourced DIY version of the big lie. Once you can doubt something as fundamental as the ground beneath your feet, you can believe anything you want. You can believe any manner of biblical revelation based on your own personal understanding of the Bible's inerrant word. You can believe that anything the government tells you is a lie. You can believe we're on the cusp of a complete upending of the world and a coming utopia. Eventually, word gets out about the fire alarms. What's happened, it seems, is that several guests staying in the hotel have left their windows open, and the smoke from the forest fires is so thick that it's setting off multiple fire alarms throughout the hotel. A voice over the intercom tells guests to return and ensure their windows are closed. And so here we are, choking on the evidence of a literal climate apocalypse, while the believers in this room have set their sights on a distant, imaginary apocalypse, one just around the corner that will soon make everything right. Rather than get to work dealing with the apocalypse drifting through the building, they are content to sit and do nothing and wait for the next one. The last panel of the conference is devoted to religion. Matt Long talks about how embracing flat Earth allowed him to read the opening verses of Genesis literally, which in turn allowed him to get closer to God. As he explains, if I can take Genesis literally, I can be more in the world. I have a moment of something like jealousy. I too would like to be more in the world. By contrast, another speaker talks about astronomy's conception of the universe, ever expanding to accommodate a multiverse, and suggests that such an idea only pushes God further away, as though heaven is a literal place reachable by spacecraft. Over the repetitive din of the fire alarm, what becomes clear to me is this. Behind Mark Sargent's pleasant rationalism, Matt Long's revivalist preaching, the Globebusters' hackneyed science, and Rob Skiba's angry denunciations, behind it all is fear. A fear of being lost, a fear of being alone, a fear of not knowing one's place in the world. During the final session, panelist Emmanuel Lakonga states it bluntly. If the earth is a flat plane, then what that means is we have a God who has not abandoned us. If there was a fundamental anxiety that drove and continues to drive the creationist and intelligent design movement, it's the bedrock fear of a world in which humanity is not at the center of all things. It is a fear that Homo sapiens are a happy accident, through endless trial and error of natural selection, slowly evolved from other animals. It is a fear of this seeming randomness more than anything that animates the ferocity of the resistance to evolution. The modern flat earth movement shares this rejection of evolution and its anxiety. It's a reaction to a new story that's emerged in the past few decades, one popularized by astrophysicists like Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who've suggested that not only is Earth a tiny, mostly unremarkable speck in the cosmos, but there are likely other universes, other planets, dark matter, and dark force, and a whole host of unexplained phenomenon that lie out there in the great beyond. There was a t-shirt popular when I was a kid that had a picture of the universe with a white arrow and pointing to a little tiny dot that read, "You are here," like the legend in a giant shopping mall. It is precisely this idea that folks are pushing back against. Instead of facing the possibility of our own insignificance, they reimagine the world, where all the stars in the sky are projections for our benefit and wonderment, where a dome encircles us and the world is rimmed with the glaciers of Antarctica, a place where God, somewhere close, but just out of reach, has not yet abandoned us. That's that.
Thank you, Dr. Dickey. I just have a few questions, and then I will open it up so everyone may also ask questions. The first thing that I mostly just wanted to find out what other kinds of conspiracy theories you're writing about. So I think most people are familiar with QAnon just because it's been so much in the news. I don't know how many people paid attention to flat earthers or knew that people still believe in a flat earth. And I think maybe some people here saw the poster, which has that intriguing image that indicates Stephen King killed John Lennon, maybe? So can you tell us about some other maybe lesser known or things we should know that you're working on now?
Yeah, well, so the book that I'm writing now, as you mentioned, is about conspiracy theories and fears around secret societies. So sort of canonically, Freemasons and the Illuminati, also, you know, anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic conspiracy theories. I'm also, though, interested in sort of secret societies that we maybe don't associate in the same breath as, you know, these kind of, you know, fictitious ones like the Underground Railroad, you know, which, you know, drove a lot of conspiracy theories in the pre-war South. You know, QAnon, of course, as you mentioned. There's a sort of weird conspiracy that like Hollywood is run by a the Homan term, which is the sort of cabal of gay and lesbian people who secretly run the culture like engine of the United States. So so that book is very much about this idea of like sort of like secret groups that are pulling the strings from behind the scenes, for better for worse. So that van, this I grew up in the Bay Area, and if you went to like the main drag in like Berkeley or Santa Cruz or San Francisco, like the Haight-Ashbury district or whatever, you would see this van that you put in that poster, which is this big panel van that says Stephen King shot John Lennon. This was like in the 90s. And he would just sort of park, and then it would say, evidence proves, or you win the van, right? And my brother and his friend and I passed by it one day, and we were just kind of marveling at it. And this guy sort of steps out to this, sort of plume of pot smoke. And my brother's friend is just like, what was Stephen King's motive for shooting John Lennon? And he does this thing, which is, I still love. It's very much like the audible, or like the audio version of like the crazy wall in like TV shows. And he's like, Nixon in, Reagan out, Reagan in, JFK out, JFK in, J. Edgar Hoover out, J. Edgar Hoover, and he like goes on, and finally it's just like, Nixon in, Lennon out, and like that's it, like that's the proof, and it was like a real marvel. I wish I had it on film because it was beautiful. So that, I mean, because quote unquote Stephen King was paid by the CIA to assassinate John Lennon, that may show up in the book in some form. There are other ones I like a lot, is this belief that the country of Finland does not exist, that there's a secret sea between, what would that be, Sweden and Russia, and Japan is illegally using it for fishing. And so Japan illegally fishes in this hidden sea, and then ships their ill-gotten fish cargo across Russia and Siberia in boxes marked Nokia. So Finland and the cell phone company Nokia all are just a front for this illegal fishing operation. And then that one I like. And then the other one, which we've talked about before, is star forts. So you guys know like the whole ancient aliens thing, that like aliens built the pyramids, which is like a pretty sort of like racist idea that like non-white people were not capable of sort of building complex things or large things, when in fact it's, that's not the case. But now it's sort of like it's turned on itself. So now there's this belief that European medieval fortresses throughout Europe are actually built by aliens. They're called star forts. Anyways, I don't know that that's in the book, but it's something on my mind. So those are some fun ones, I guess.
Okay, so just another one or two for me. Along the lines of what the piece you just read, the part of your ability to write about these things is that you go to places where these groups meet. But you also, in the piece you read, talked a lot about people from different centuries. So to what extent does your writing get built from firsthand interviews? Like, what are your methods for learning more about these things?
My methods are kind of, and I should probably not say this in front of like students, but my methods are pretty slapdash. Like and this is honestly, I mean, I got a PhD in comparative literature, but I chose not to sort of follow an academic path, and chose to kind of focus on general nonfiction, because I think what I was not good at was doing the thing that scholars can do, which I'm absolutely in awe of and have the utmost respect for, of picking a topic and then just going in and doing, like just getting down to the point where they have a complete grasp of whatever that topic is. It's a Shakespeare play, or it's a moment in historical time. They've read the archives, they've done all that stuff. I think that is such an amazing talent, and something that I wish I could do, but I'm not good at doing. So what I do instead is I grab from a million different places. So yeah, so I will go to the place, I will talk to people, I will read a bunch of stuff, like I'm I obviously I do as much research as I can, but I will read, I'll read like a handful of newspapers over here, and then I'll read a handful of scholarly articles over here, and then I'll interview a couple people, but I'll just kind of grab kind of crazily left and right and just start to make like piles of stuff. And then at some point it becomes a question of like, okay, what am I missing? And then I have to go back and do like the actual, like, all right, now I have to do the scholarly part, make sure that I filled in the gaps, make sure that I know what I'm saying, know that I'm not like, leaving some great hole. But my initial mode is to just kind of just take anything that seems like it might be interesting to me until I start to have enough of a kind of critical mass that the shape of the thing starts to reveal itself to me.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more thing. And this is related to talking to people. You ask follow-up questions and sort of put pressure on some of the moments where they fall back into these sort of easy rhetorical responses rather than actually having real evidence. I guess this is maybe a little bit of a two-parter. I wonder how common those like sort of tells are where people just keep relying on the same thing in order to sort of diffuse any line of questioning that hits home as maybe they're not believing in something real. And the other part is just how do you not get taken in and how do you not laugh? I mean, how do you respond when someone is doing that, I guess is the big question.
Well, I mean, if this is somebody's sincere belief, I don't find myself like laughing just in the sense of like, I'm not interested in like ridiculing somebody if this is something that matters to them. I do get taken in because a lot of times, so like I didn't talk about this in the piece, but like when I was talking to Mark Sargent, one of the things he said to me was that you can go online and you can look at flight trackers, right? That are basically real-time websites that will show you where you type in the flight that you're looking for, and it shows you the kind of radar of like where it is in the sky, right? And he says, in the Northern Hemisphere, you get this squiggly line because it's this real accurate, measure of this thing. But in the Southern Hemisphere, you get these swooping parabolas, and that's because they're making that part up. Because if you remember the UN logo, like the northern hemisphere sort of is like accurate, and the Southern Hemisphere is huge, right? And so like when they're flight tracking normal flights in the Northern Hemisphere, they can show you accurately, but they're pulling these wild shenanigans in flights over the Southern Hemisphere, and so they show these parabolas instead. And he told me that, and I was like, alarm bells are going off in my head. I was like, this seems crazy and wrong. But in the speed of the conversation, like I couldn't stop and fact check. I don't know how radar works. Like it turns out, and again, like once I spent 2 seconds Googling this is very obvious, is that radar, he's basically confused GPS with radar. GPS is like, you have a GPS thing on you, it sends out a signal and it identifies your precise location. Radar is like, there's a thing on the ground that sends out a radar signal, it bounces off the plane and it comes back, right? So of course there is no accurate line in the middle of the Southern Pacific Ocean because there's no radar station in the middle of the Southern Ocean. So if you look at those flight trackers, in fact, like even in the Northern Hemisphere, as soon as the flight is over water, you get those parabolas again, and so again, like once I was like, this is crazy talk, but I couldn't say anything to him at the time because I didn't know the science. And then I looked up the science and I was like, oh, of course, that's why this seemed nuts to me. And so, and I mean, he talked about like, why like Google Maps over Antarctica looks so fake compared to Google Maps over North America. And I had to go to a cartographer friend to explain to me, like, it's because Google Maps is made up of satellite passes, and satellites pass over North America a whole lot more because it's, satellite companies and governments are way more interested in what's going on there than they are in Antarctica. So satellite passes only pass over Antarctica a couple of times. So yeah, it's low res, and so again, like once he explained it, I was like, yeah, all right. So, I think the thing to do is I just I ask like there's like a limited amount you can prep for. You can only prep for so much, because everybody's going to come at you with these like crazy off the wall theories. So I mostly just kind of let people talk, and I push back on things that I think I can push back on. But I don't try and pick fights, because I think you get more out of it if you just let someone talk. They'll make it clear where they stand. You don't have to actually do that work for them. So
Thank you. Okay, I have one follow-up and an announcement, but I'm going to precede my announcement by saying the chat is now open, and you can either type any question you'd like to ask Dr. Dickey in the chat. You could also, if you would like to ask it in person, you can use the raise hand function, which is available to you. It should be in the reactions button on Zoom. And also you can use the participants window. I think you can pull down something beside your name that allows you to raise your hand. So if you'd like to ask him directly, please do raise your hand. And if you'd just like to have a question out there and I'll read it, you can type it in the chat. The announcement I'd like to make is the winner of our signed copy of Dr. Dickey's book, The Unidentified, is Noah Massey. Massey? Yeah, there's Noah. Congratulations, Noah. We'll get that in the mail to you.
Okay, it's Massey.
Oh, Massey. Sorry.
You're not the first person. You're not the first one to think that. You're not going to be the last.
Sorry about that.
It's cool.
All right. So let's see. We have a question from Cassandra, who asks, how do you think believers fall into this way of thinking initially? What grabs and brings a lot of people in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, I don't know if you guys can hear it, but the steam radiator in my apartment is currently going off. So if there's a weird hissing noise in the background, that's what that is. I apologize. Yeah, Cassandra, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that what I've found is, I think like for a long time, I thought you could just tell people the truth, what was factually correct, and that would solve the problem. And that sort of never worked, like chiming in on somebody's Facebook page saying like, hey, in fact, this is the thing, just doesn't work at all. What I think I've found is that for most conspiracy theories, what they are doing is they are allowing the person to believe something that is pleasurable to them. And that's kind of what I talked about with like Mark Sargent's idea that this is the tip of the spear. Like if you believe that the earth is flat, you can believe whatever you want. It's liberating, right? Like, do you believe that like, I don't know, vaccines are a hoax? Go for it. Like, do you want to believe that you want to believe some horrible racist thing? Go for it. Like there's like, and I think that, those are kind of negative versions, but I interviewed a friend of mine who was he wasn't a believer in QAnon, but he believed in a similar conspiracy theory about a ring of sexual predators in Oklahoma in the 80s. And he was very, very moved by this conspiracy theory. And I wrote a kind of piece kind of analyzing our conversation. What occurred to me is that he was someone who took the safety of children very seriously, and believing in this conspiracy theory allowed him to sort of actualize that concern for young children and their safety. And I think that's a very good impulse. Like, I think, he's a good, kind person. I like him a lot, but like that impulse then drove him to kind of embrace this thing, which I looked at and I was like, there's no way this actually happened. And so I think that it's going to be different for every person, but I think that most conspiracy theories they start from like somebody looking for permission to believe a thing, or a means to really embrace a belief that they have, and then the conspiracy comes along and it sort of invites them to kind of indulge that, and so they go for it.
We also have a question from Sarah, who asks, what are your thoughts on the conspiracy surrounding COVID-19? How do you think we should go about limiting the misinformation that spreads rapidly nowadays?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, it's such a good question. It's so crazy and infuriating. And yeah, and again, it's like, a lot of it, I think, has to do with the question of like, what is, when you have somebody who believes, that it's a hoax, or the vaccines don't work, or whatever. The question always in my mind is like, what is this doing for this person? Like, what is it helping them to do? Like I feel like there are some people for whom they are genuinely concerned about their economic well-being. Maybe they're like, restaurant is on the verge of closing, or maybe they've been laid off, or like, or they don't have health insurance. And so they will say, the lockdown is a hoax, is a not a hoax, but like the lockdown is not what we should be doing, right? And like, so like that's an example of like someone like, I understand why people are anxious and nervous and scared. The solution is not to end the lockdowns. The solution is for the federal government to like pay our paychecks so that we can afford to stay home, but that's the thing. It's like that, at least under the previous administration, that wasn't going to happen. And so the impossibility of the correct answer started to breed these kind of other things. I mean, there are other things that are like, I think that, I think again, like Mark Sargent is a good example of a kind of person who will always believe the government is up to no good. And particularly when it involves like big pharma, right? Like big pharma and the government are up to no good. So as soon as the government says, Pfizer has created a vaccine, everybody should get it, that's gonna trigger a response from somebody of like, there's no way that's on the level, and that again is not entirely that person's fault. I mean, like big pharma is not great. Like the OxyContin scandal is a disaster. Like government lies to us all the time. Like, the question is less like, I'm not, like the question is not you should believe blindly everything the government tells you, especially if it involves big misses. The question is like, how do we reestablish consensus of like what is and isn't acceptable skepticism? And I think that's a really difficult and complicated question that I don't have a great answer for you right now, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, and there are a couple other questions I'll certainly get to in the chat, but I just wanted to follow up on that. The sort of what's the spectrum of responses is these people are amusing to these people are very dangerous. And in your work, how many of the groups that you're looking at would you sort of make a taxonomy of, these people are actually dangerous?
I mean, I am a very conflict averse person. So I actually am very scared of the people with guns, and I do not want to antagonize them. My friend Talia Lavin wrote this book on white supremacists, and she is like the fiercest person I know. And the book is great, and I highly recommend it. Lavin is Lavin, and it's phenomenal. And she's the person who like goes into these Discord chats under an assumed name to talk to like Nazis, and like she's like a Jewish woman, talking to Nazis and like trying to figure out what's going on with them. And I think that is amazing. And I'm like, I just cannot do that. It stresses me out in this kind of way. And so I tend to stay away from the really scary ones, although I mean QAnon is sort of a kind of terrifying thing right now, but it's also like that's America for you, so that's it's kind of unavoidable in that regard. So yeah,
there's a flat earther question here from Kevin, who asks where they got their inspiration that the earth is flat and the government is covering something up. Where did they get their ideas?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember that, because I saw your question a couple seconds ago. I'm trying to remember, because I know when I talked to Mark Sargent, he said he started with the Jfk assassination theories. So he starts with this idea that the government covered up JFK's assassination, and then he moved from there to, as I recall him saying, it was sort of like an intellectual curiosity, where he was sort of like, well, let's check out this one. Like you would like look up something on a Wikipedia page almost, so it's like, what's going on here? And then he would keep trying to find the most far out conspiracy until he came to flat Earth, and he was like, well, this is the ultimate. If I can believe that the Earth is flat, I can believe anything. Almost like, I mean, it's been a while. That interview was in 2017. but my recollection, it was almost like he was almost like daring himself, and then that became his thing, and that became what he became known for. As I said, I think the vast majority of flat earthers come at it through a kind of biblical perspective. At one point during the conference, one of the panelists asked, like, how many people here believe the earth is flat, but do not believe in a Christian God? And one person in the room raised their hand. So, I think with the case of flat earth, it does come pretty heavily from a kind of religious literalism, where you're trying to square passages in the Bible with, what you've been told about how the world works.
Okay. Savannah just made a connection to the Paul McCartney death conspiracy, which I think was a connection she was making before we moved on to other topics. And then Caitlin wants, her question is, you use the word liberating. Can you explain the relationship of being constrained to conspiracy theories and its appeal?
Yeah, so the anthropologist, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss has this phrase. He's talking about why cultures make totems in the shape of animals. And he says, animals aren't just good to eat, they're good to think. And what he means by that is that animals are good to think with, right? There's something pleasurable and rewarding about thinking with these things. And I think of that phrase. I think that conspiracy theories are good to think. And again, I think the COVID reality is a good example of that, because the last year has been miserable and awful. And it's been depressing and hard. I mean, it's, for most of us, I think, I know, myself included, just a lot of us just going through just lots of depression over this. If someone comes along and says, it's all a lie, there's something that's sort of suddenly kind of well, maybe my depression is not unavoidable. Maybe I can get out of this terrible feeling I'm having if I start to deny the reality around me. And so that's what I mean when I think of liberating, right? I think another way that conspiracy theories are liberating is you were taught that racism is bad, which it is, but maybe you are secretly racist and you like thinking racist thoughts, but you're not allowed to, right? And then somebody comes along with some dumb conspiracy theory about the Jews or about Black people or something like that, and suddenly you're like, oh, now it is okay for me to think this racist thought because there is actually something that quote unquote proves it, right? Again, I'm obviously not defending this. I'm just sort of I think that drives a lot of this, and this idea that conspiracy theories allow you to think the unthinkable, and that gives people a kind of sense of pleasure and power.
Yeah, I'm gonna just pick up on that and cut to the very most recent post in the chat, because it does ask that question: is it that there's community there? That, and how much is the appeal about community?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah, and this is very true of the QAnon movement, because one of the things that QAnon promises is that you there at home, sitting on your laptop by yourself at night with just Google and nothing else, you can help unravel a worldwide conspiracy of powerful democratic elites who abduct children, drink their blood, and ritually sacrifice them. And you yourself can be part of the team that solves it. There's this real sort of, this is why, my friend who I was talking about earlier, who believe, he didn't, I would talk to him about the Catholic sex abuse scandal, which is not a conspiracy. I mean, it's not a theory, it's a real thing that happened. And he was totally unmoved by it. And it's because there was no room for him to insert himself into that story. If he's the only person who knows about this secret ring in Oklahoma and he's going around telling people about it, then he's kind of a hero, right? He's blowing the lid off this thing. And so, what QAnon and Flat Earth and what these conspiracy groups do is they sort of they liberate you, they sort of empower you in this kind of inverted way. They welcome you in as this part of coterie of true believers, and they make you feel special as like you are part of a secret kind of like clique that alone can blow the lid off of this terrible hidden secret.
Yeah, and I should say that last point about community came from Frank. Sarah Schwartz says, what are your thoughts on the relationship between internet social media access and conspiracy theories? Does the ability to find and connect with conspiracy theories online heighten their impact and scope?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question, because I think that on the one hand, I don't want to say that it has no effect, like it obviously does. On the other hand, I think there's a real danger in saying that the current moment that we have, where we're sort of riven by conspiracy theories, is somehow reducible entirely to social media, because the last the first time a conspiracy theory around the Illuminati influenced a presidential election was the year 1800. Like, there were rumors of secret cabals of evil people abducting children and ritually sacrificing them in 1834 in Charleston, Massachusetts, in 1915 in Atlanta, Georgia, throughout the country in the 1980s as part of the Satanic Panic conspiracy. So these things are not new to social media. And we tend to think, one of the reasons that I'm writing the book that I'm writing now, is because I think that we have this popular belief that like there were two times in which Americans sort of gave themselves over to a kind of moral panic hysteria. One was Salem, and one was the McCarthy hearings, right? And like those are the ones we talk about: Salem witch trials and the McCarthy hearings. And we don't talk about the fact that there have been moral panics basically every generation, and each one has its own specificity and its own kind of nuance, and so you can't just conflate them all. But also, if you don't recognize the history and how each one of them sort of like is just a repetition of what's happened, then you reach this moment where you look around and you see QAnon and you see Pizzagate and you think, this must be happening for the first time. It must have something to do with social media, when in fact, I think social media is just one small part of a very much more complicated mechanism. So.
Okay, it's a good time for Christopher's question, because he notes that some conspiracies die out, and he mentions the theory that 2012 would be the end of the world, and clearly that's not, or that the Y2K bug was going to destroy the internet. So given that sometimes conspiracy theories die, how do they die? And do you think any of these big conspiracy theories today, like QAnon, are heading in this direction? Please say yes.
Yeah, well, it's a very tough time for QAnon, because unlike some other conspiracy theories, as you mentioned with Y2K in 2012, they keep picking dates, which is something you should never do if you want a long-running conspiracy theory. And again, this is something that is like, part of American history. The Millerites were famously this, kind of millenarian movement in the 1840s. It was like, we picked a date, everybody quit their jobs, we're all going to wait for Jesus to come back, and he sort of didn't come back, became known as the Great Disappointment. One of the books, or one of the stories that I talk about in my book, The Unidentified, is this UFO cult run by Dorothy Martin out of Oak Park, Illinois, who announced that the world was going to end on December 21st, 1955, through a giant flood, but that UFOs were going to take her and her followers up to safety. And her group was infiltrated by a couple of sociologists, including Leon Festinger, who wrote the book When Prophecy Fails, about where he coined the term cognitive dissonance, which is what does your brain do when like you were expecting a thing to happen, it doesn't happen, like, and so he talked a lot about that. I'm sure a lot of you guys know this book, but he talked a lot about that question of like, what do you do the day after the apocalypse? How do you pick up? And what happened with Dorothy Martin's group, what happened with the Millerites, what's happening with QAnon is you lose some of the margins. You lose some of the people on the margins. And like, you know, when I went into Gab.com on January 20th, the day of the inauguration, you know, you could see a lot of frustration and disillusionment and anger and people turning on each other and a sense of like of disarray. And then what happened is they picked a new date, and the new date is March 20th, or no, sorry, March 4th, which was the original date we used to inaugurate presidents, right? And so, so now QAnon is saying, oh, March 4th is when Trump is coming back into power. So each time they bump it forward, there's gonna they are putting, you know, it's like gambling. It's like double or nothing. Like they keep bumping up the stakes and pushing it forward, and each time they're wrong, it's harder and harder to spin that into a narrative. So I do think that we're going to lose some of it, but I also guess I disagree a little bit that Y2K ever went away, because I think that what we are dealing with now is the legacy of a generation that was expecting the apocalypse in the year 2000, and the apocalypse never came, and has been struggling ever since to reconcile a kind of perpetually apocalyptic worldview with you know, a history that keeps stumbling forward, for better or for worse.
I guess Noah also says this. I guess we'll find out about that tomorrow. I mean, that's
Oh, right.
really
Is it? Oh my gosh, I
that's,
didn't even realize.
that's tomorrow. Mm-hmm.
Tomorrow, yeah. All
I feel
right.
like I don't have enough time to prepare for that. Let's see. So Ambrose wants to know why the JFK assassination is such a popular starting point.
I mean, it's the same way, you know, like Abraham Lincoln's assassination was a huge moment in the 19th century. I think we have this belief that the American government is resilient and strong, and like if something were going to happen to the American government, like a president being assassinated, it can't just be one lucky guy, one crazy guy who gets lucky with a couple sniper shots. It has to be a massive coordinated attempt. And I think that people struggle, and you know, and add to that, I think there was some confusion. I don't necessarily entertain a lot of JFK conspiracy theories, but like the government by nature is has become sort of obfuscating in its regard towards its own citizens. You know, like we don't get the full story hardly ever. We, you know, like you know, again, in the Unidentified, I talked a lot about this in regards to the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is like some guys in the desert secretly making a weapon that nobody could even conceive of before, that destroyed whole cities with just a little tiny thing. And like, that's crazy talk. So, you know, we are used to the idea that the government does terrible things in secret that we don't know about. And so then something that is completely unpredictable and seems to go against the sovereignty of the government comes along, and we're told, you know, and again, I believe this actually happened because I haven't seen anything to the contrary, but you know, that one guy with a sniper rifle managed to fire off enough shots to, you know, kill JFK, and like that's what happened. But you know, you can see why that just doesn't hold water for some people, because it creates that kind of cognitive dissonance. So.
Okay, we still have time for a couple more. Stephen Constantinople asks, he says, QAnon also uses do your own research. Is that a connection between the groups or a commonality among conspiracy theory groups?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, no, it's just a feature of conspiracy theories. I think that mantra gets used because it sounds scientific. At the same time, it's basically like the point of it is licensed to basically believe whatever you want. So yeah, so I mean, there's certainly overlap between flat earthers and conspiracy theories or QAnon people, but that mantra, do your own research, is just something you see time and time again. So.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it from the flip side, just from the scholarship, that seeing documents rare documents in archives actually makes things seem so much more real, and often, you know, your mentors as scholars say, you know, well, you really have to go look at the text in person. You have to see it, and you know, so it's sort of riffing on what is just sort of a hallmark of academic credentialism. It's like you can't make these claims unless you've seen the material yourself. But then this is a mantra that kind of opens it up in an unelitist way to say anybody can do this research. You don't have to be a PhD or a scholar. You can do this research. And so it's sort of a leveling principle that is very appealing, I imagine. Oh, still admitting people in. Let's see. Okay. Eric wants to know, I don't think this is a serious question, but he wants to know if America is turning into a bad country western song. My heart's been broken, I'm sad, drunk, and alone. I'm not sure you want to field that one.
No.
I'll also read Rebecca's question, which is, how can you research conspiracy theories so deeply and still stay distant enough not to fall victim to?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the easiest ways is to remind yourself, and I'm sorry to be a little glib about this, but just how like racist so many of them are. Like it's actually like the opposite. It's like I just get demoralized. Like, like there is, and again, I'm writing about this right now for the book that I'm writing now, but like there's a mechanism of conspiracy theory that like it in the Western world, it almost always falls back on anti-Semitism. Like there's like, it doesn't matter if you're talking about aliens and UFOs or flat earth or QAnon or Bigfoot or whatever, there's this repeated function of the way that anti-Semitism works in most of these conspiracy theories that is just bleak and really demoralizing in it. And so I think like it would be hard for me to lose sight of that in any way, but I think and again, what I did with the Unidentified is I tried my best to kind of keep an open mind, and I got to the end of the book. I mean, I didn't try and keep my open mind about the anti-Semitism, obviously, but I got to the end of the book, and I came across like probably like a handful of stories that I just didn't have a solution for. Like the Lawndale incident of 1977, the Gloucester sea serpent of 1816. The Socorro, New Mexico UFO sighting. There's maybe one or two others that I just like. I got like I put on my best like skeptical, rational, scientific explanation for, and it came back and was just like, I don't know. The Kentucky meat shower of 1876. I don't know. And so so with that book, like it wasn't about sort of like, like, did I end up falling for conspiracy theories, but I did try and like make this space between the kind of knee-jerk default skepticism that anything that looks weird is there's like there's, I don't know, it's a hallucination or you're just an idiot, versus anything that looks weird is obviously this crazy thing. Like there has to be some sort of like gray area in the middle. And I took a lot of inspiration from the writings of Charles Fort, and his book, The Book of the Damned, where he basically gathers up a bunch of these. He's famous for like writing about frog showers, when frogs fall from the sky. And like, the scientific explanation is that like a tornado or something has gone over a pond and has scooped up all the frogs in the tornado and then is raining them somewhere else. But that's a really dumb explanation. That's an awful explanation, but there are documented stories of like frogs and fish falling from the sky. And like Fort's whole thing, this is why it's called The Book of the Damned, because these facts are damned. And he's basically saying like, you don't have to believe one thing or another, but you can't ignore that these things are in the historical record. They exist in the historical record. The Kentucky meat shower was a documented event one way or another, whatever you think happens to it or happened there. And so I try and keep an open mind in that regard. But again, I think that I try to also be aware of just like the harm and pain that a lot of these things like do, both to the believers and also like the subjects of these conspiracy theories. So.
You are probably going to spark a lot of Google searches for meat showers in Kentucky and frog rain. We have just a little bit more time, so I'll ask you Sabrina's question, which is, what made you want to research conspiracy theories in the first place?
So my first book, as Vim talked about in the opening, my first book was about that I stumbled across this story that in the early 19th century, about 1790 to 1840, a number of famous people's skulls were stolen. So Mozart had his head stolen. Parts of Beethoven's skull were stolen. Emanuel Swedenborg's, Thomas Brown, Franz Joseph Haydn. And I was just like, why were people stealing the heads of like Viennese composers? Like, what is that about? One of Franz Joseph Haydn's friends waited until the guy was dead. 5 days after his death, bribed the gravedigger to dig up the body of his friend in an advanced state of decomposition, cut off his head, cleaned it, stuck the skull in a glass box, and kept it on his mantelpiece. Why would you do that? And so the answer, in brief, was that it was part of this craze of phrenology, this idea that like the bumps on your head reveal the indications of your personality, right? So phrenology is total garbage science. Everybody knows it's garbage science, but the realization was, just because it's garbage science doesn't mean that it didn't drive people to do this thing, and this thing like had an impact in the world, you know, like and so I got interested in not just conspiracy theories, but like fringe beliefs in general, because I came to the realization that just because they might be like wrong or unprovable or bizarre doesn't mean they don't influence the world that we live in. And in fact, it probably influence our world much more than we're aware of, precisely because we don't take them seriously. And so I wanted to take these things seriously without like necessarily feeling like the dynamics seem to be either you debunk them and prove that they were idiotic, or you believed in them. And I'm just not interested in either of those dynamics, because I'm more interested in the way that these beliefs, whether or not they're true or not, impact the world around us. And so that's kind of, you know, so I went from phrenology to, you know, bizarre Catholicism to, you know, ghosts, to cryptids and UFOs. And now I'm at conspiracy theories. So.
Okay, I'm afraid, and we still do have time for one last one, and I'm afraid to ask this one because of what Ambrose might do with this information, but he would like to know, how do you make a conspiracy theory? And if you know how to make one, does it make you invulnerable to other conspiracy theories and then better debunk? Is this a how-to?
Right. Yeah,
I want to clarify. I want to help debunk other conspiracy theories with this knowledge.
Okay.
Sure. I believe you. No, no. I mean, yeah, I think the question is, you know, one of the things we've just been circling around this whole hour is this idea of like, if you want it to take off, like, what does it do for people? You know, like, what does it allow them to believe? And I think once you have tapped into something, I mean, I guess if I were going to because I would just throw a bunch of crap against the wall. I just spent a lot of time on Reddit posting things like, did you know that, you know, the 6th page of every single book has the word the on the 4th line? Did you guys know that? Do you know why? What's that about? I don't know. Like, and just like, I just post crap like that and see who cared, you know, but like sooner or later, oh, is that Memo? Hi, Memo. You know, sooner or later, I don't know, something would probably, somebody be like, yeah, like, I don't know, there are people who are out there looking for weird conspiracy theories to get into, you know, like Finland doesn't exist. You know, you can find them, I guess. So, yeah.
So we still have 5 minutes, so I'm going to use it. One of the things that we learned at an event on QAnon last week was that there are a lot of women in QAnon, and I guess after, you know, they talked about it, it made some sense, and for the same reason that your friend sort of got into child sex trafficking conspiracy theories. Sorry, I added that too late there. But your friend who was involved in or persuaded by those, this idea that you're helping children. The ones that you talk about in addition to QAnon, are there breakdowns by gender in terms of who seems to be leading these movements or proponents behind their spread?
Yeah, I mean, if I could be like overly reductive historically for a second, conspiracy theories in the 19th century, the victims are primarily adult women, right? So like anti-Catholic conspiracy theories around convents are like Catholic priests are using their mind control powers to get young women into convents where they can control them and make them do horrible sexual things, and then when they get pregnant, ritually murder the babies and then bury them in the convent. And like this is, people absolutely believe this stuff. And this, you know, the idea that like basically the idea that like we must protect the women is a pretty strong motion through a lot of these conspiracy theories in the 19th century. My, again, like being a little reductive here, but you know, if I was gonna like, you know, put this in one sentence, my take is that what changes in the 70s and 80s is the rise of like feminism, more or less, or at least, you know, the articulation of modern feminism. And that's when you get the satanic panic conspiracy theories, where it's now the children who are at risk. And it's almost as like, we can't save the women anymore because we can't conceptualize them as kind of docile objects that must be protected. Well, we can do that to the children. And again, this is a super fast and loose distillation of a much more complicated trajectory. But like I think that both the satanic panic, you know, hysteria, and also QAnon, what's at issue along with this like obsession with children is also an obsession about why aren't their mothers, you know, this is all in scare quotes, why aren't their mothers doing a better job of taking care of them? Why have mothers abandoned their role as the raisers of children to such a degree that now the children are at risk by these terrible forces? So like, I think that with QAnon and with these conspiracy theories that we've been talking about, there's so many layers of gender being articulated, and it's probably in the, you know, last 2 minutes we have sort of not easy to get into, but I will just say yes, I guess. So.
Okay. Well, thanks to everyone for coming, and thank you to Dr. Dickey for sharing your work with us today. And his most recent book is available, The Unidentified. You can get it on Bookshop or Amazon or anything else where you buy your books. And Noah, your copy will be mailed to you. And everyone else, have a wonderful Wednesday. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks everything. Thanks for the book.